The Ghost Catcher, Part 3. Down at the harbour, Silas sat Timmy down on the edge of the high wall, the little boy's feet dangling over the drop into the water below, and after taking off his pack, Silas sat down next to him. Around them the wind blew through the masts, whistling to them, and below the water, calmer now the tide was ebbing out, lapped gently against the harbour wall. Apart from this, there was no sound at all. "What are we doing?" asked Timmy. "Waiting," said Silas, as he unpacked a few items from his pack that he set down between Timmy and he. Some Timmy recognised, like the pipe and gas lighter, or the little lantern, half the size of a normal one. Other devices he had to ask the net maker about. "This is a wind gauge," said Silas, holding up a small instrument that looked like a pocket watch with a tiny windmill attached. "It measures how fast and from which direction the wind is going to go in." "Going to?" Timmy queried at the man's odd turn of phrase. Silas only smiled in response. "And this is a quick draw," said Silas, moving on to a small glass ball about the size of an apple, attached by strong twine to an iron locking clip. "Inside the bulb is a very special type of air that does some very funny things, but could be quite useful to us on a night like tonight." Silas gently set the instrument down next to them and picked up his pipe and lighter. As he shielded his hands from the breeze and lit the pipe, beside him Timmy shivered. "Don't worry yourself, boy," said Silas suddenly, making Timmy jump a little. "They'll be coming soon, but they won't be after me or you." "What are they?" said Timmy, looking up, his voice half suggesting that he didn't want to know the answer. "Memories," said Silas. "They're memories of people who used to live here but have moved on. Strong memories that don't want to leave." "You mean of people who were here but died?" asked Timmy. "Like Barnacote the shearer and the old major?" Silas nodded as he drew air through his pipe and exhaled. "Yep, that'd be right." Timmy could remember the fuss that had been made over an accident up on End Barton where one of the shearers, a man named Dale Barnacote, had died in the workshops, and the solemn looks on the folk when Major, a man whose real name Timmy never knew but who was by all intents and purposes the oldest man in town who had lived up in the manor house, had passed away. To a child, death was never the same thing as it was to an adult, thought Silas as he watched the boy thinking, and then turned his attention back to the water below. "How comes we've never seen them before?" asked Timmy. "The ghosts, I mean." "Some of us have," Silas said. "Them stories your pa will have told you, back when you was proper little. I guess you'll have figured out they're not just fairy tales to scare you away from playing outside at night. I'll guess he also probably gave you a good bit of detail, like how we ward them off or caught them in the end." Silas looked at Timmy. Below them, almost imperceptibly, the wind picked up. "He always used to say that's why everyone kept a bucket of chalk around the house," said Timmy, as though he were reciting schoolwork for a test. "And that chalk they used to make symbols over each person's door to confuse them." He looked back up at Silas as though to ask if he had it right, and the ghost catcher smiled back at him. "Your pa taught you right," said Silas as he looked out again, this time to sea and then back inland, as though he were following with his eyes a specific gust of wind. Suddenly, from a distance, they both heard a high, shrill cry, like the wind again, but this time with a metallic edge to it, like the noise a butcher's knife against a sharpening block might make. Silas turned his head to look back towards the town, and Timmy looked with him, the boy taking harsh, deep breaths, the man's face hard, his mouth a thin line. "They're coming again," said Silas, an air of triumph in his voice. "Where?" asked Timmy, unable to hide the worry as he spoke. "Here," said Silas, and this time Timmy really did feel the wind pick up at the man's words. "They'll come through here first. Just a few to begin with, the stronger ones, and then the little ones will come behind." "Why are they coming here first?" asked Timmy as he watched the little gusts of wind get stronger and pick spray up off the water's surface to spin and funnel into little water spirits. "Because we're here," said Silas, as he did so, swinging his legs back over the wall and pulling Timmy with him back onto the dry land. Another high scream of noise, this time closer. Silas left the wind gauge on the wall that Timmy noticed was currently registering no wind at all, despite the rising gale around them. The ghost catcher picked up the quick draw and the lantern, which he lit quickly, and attached both to the webbing slung across his chest. From his pack he produced a large net, carefully packed and folded so that he could hang it from one shoulder and not need to worry about it, and also a length of strong twine which he tied a loop in and approached Timmy with. "Arms up," he ordered, and Timmy obeyed, noticing how Silas had to speak up slightly now over the rising noise of the wind. Closer again, another scream came. Silas lowered the loop over Timmy until it was down around his waist, which he then pulled tight, attaching the other end with another iron clip to his own belt so the two were leashed together. "Don't want you running off now," said Silas with a grim smile. Timmy had no intention whatsoever of leaving the ghost catcher's side, if anything moving closer as the man looked around him in careful consideration. Another wail came through the night, closely followed by a second. Silas and Timmy were now stood in the middle of the main thoroughfare for the harbour, where in the daytime horses and carts might bustle along to load and unload their cargo and wares, but where now the only traffic was that of the wind and occasional sea spray that flitted up the road. "They'll come past us first," repeated Silas, "but they won't be after us. They won't want us yet." "What do they want?" Timmy called back, as though they stood a great distance apart, but in reality were almost touching. "They'll want to go home first," said Silas, as he spoke, still looking around him for signs of movement, listening carefully to the screams and wails that were now an almost constant chorus backed by the gale around them. Maybe not their own homes, like the homes the person they belonged to lived when they were alive, but just any home that people still live in. As Timmy looked back over at the harbour wall, the wind gauge still remained illogically still in the gale. He took another step closer and shamelessly took a hold of Silas's belt. "But they'll get there, back in the town," said Silas. "They'll not get in. They'll find every house with chalk above the doors, and they'll not be able to get in. And then the real work starts." As he said this, Silas moved suddenly, yanking Timmy with him as he spotted the darker shadow flash out of an alleyway and over the harbour wall. A minute later, another one flew past them at an unreal speed and disappeared under a boat awning. As the wind rose once more, Timmy looked at the houses around him, and suddenly it were as though the buildings themselves throbbed and blurred, as though the moonlight dimmed but the bricks and mortar became clearer to see, and each house grew a shadow of its own, until the shadows separated from the houses and rooftops, and the army of spectres rose above the town, each one humming or screaming or chuckling or panting. The wind stopped dead. Everything was still. The ghosts moved in the same split second that Silas did, at once the shadows descending on the town as the ghost catcher grabbed the little boy's hand, and they both ran back through the town towards the square. The shadows slipped around houses and down drain pipes, through mouse holes and around drain grates, flattening against the streets and cobbles, and as one sloshing and sliding towards the town square where Mac waited. Underneath his running feet, Timmy looked down, and it were as though the ground slithered beneath him, like standing on the beach as the tide washed over his bare feet in two directions at once. As they ran, Timmy thought he could almost feel their icy grasp on him. "Now don't be looking down there," said Silas with a tug at the boy's hand. "Always look where you're running, and when it's ghosts you're running from, don't ever stop until I say." At this the two ran on as around them the tide of spectres raced them back towards the square, which in only a few moments they had come into sight of again. "Mac!" called Silas, and saw the boy's father wave back to them in acknowledgement. "Mac, be ready!" Around the square, Mac had, with the help of Skell and a few others who had all once again taken refuge in their homes or the tavern, dragged barrels of chalk out onto the square and hastily drawn out 6 circles, each the same distance from the last, so if one drew a line connecting them all, it might form a hexagon. The 2 large barrels themselves, still half full of chalk, stood in the middle of the square, flanking the sailor as he watched Silas and his son rush across the cobbles and flagstones, surrounded and chased by the ghostly presence. All around the square and throughout the town where the word had spread, circles had been drawn above alternate doorways and triangles above the rest, the doors of which were locked and bolted from within, where families hid and hoped that the ghost catcher could once again protect them. End of part 3.